I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome back to our rattle through the anthology movies from Amicus. We've already looked at Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, so now it's time to move on to the wonderfully titled Torture Garden. What an evocative title, what horrific delights could lay beyond a film with that kind of name. Well, there isn't really any torture in it and there isn't a garden. We find ourselves at a fairground, which is an absolutely apposite setting for a neat little anthology horror movie. And there, one of the shows is Dr. Diabolo's Torture Garden. And it's a sort of waxworks which show different forms of torture throughout the ages. And that's it. That's where the title begins and ends. In the same vein that the previous film, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Dr. Schreck, which is German for fear, calls his tarot deck his House of Horrors. So we'll just quickly get that out of the way with and move on with the stories we were going to tell anyway. It's directed again by Freddie Francis, but this time written by Robert Bloch, who is developing his own short stories for the screen. After the main show, which is quite lame to be honest, of the Torture Garden is over, Dr. Diabolo takes off his executioner's hood and says, "Oh, if anyone wants to stay and pay £5, there's a much better show backstage, which is actually properly scary. So if any of you have got the cojones to stay and pay, we'll put on another show." It's a bit rich. Come into my torture garden, watch all these horrific delights, then admit that show is pretty naff. But I promise you, I've got a really good show backstage. It's just cost you an extra $5. But what we get in grand anthology Amicus tradition is a loose band of strangers deciding, no, I will stay and I will listen to that siren song, The Allure of the Unknown, and we will go backstage and see what those actual horrors are. And by the way, if you can't tell what the character reveal of Dr. Diabolo is going to be at the end of the movie, then there is no hope for you. I don't know why it is in films that the devil finds such transparent nom de plume for himself. And yes, I am looking at you, Louis Cypher. This time round, the ringmaster for our framework story is the wonderful Burgess Meredith, and he is in full Twilight Zone mode. There's a devilish grin on his face, a sort of impish twinkle in his eye as he plays this game of fate with these 5 curious strangers. The attraction, he reveals, is another waxwork, strangely played by a person who never moved. So it is a person playing a waxwork of one of the Greek fates, Atropos. And I believe the Greek fates, one of them spun out the thread of your life, the second one measured it, and Atropos with her shears cut your life off at the point of death. And it is she who is the attraction, and you must stand before her and stare at her shears and see this fate that is predicted for you. The first gentleman to do so helps us segue into the first story called Enoch. He's a sort of gadabout town who has a habit of losing all of his money, so he goes to visit his only living relative, an elderly uncle who is also pretty much knocking on death's door to try and get some more funds out of him, or at least secure his inheritance. And when his uncle insists that he doesn't have any money, but the nephew knows full bloody well he does, because he pays for everything mysteriously with these gold coins, so believes that he has a treasure trove somewhere in the house. This is very much another one of these stories in the mould of someone getting their comeuppance. So there's a little murder, and then the nephew has the chance to ransack the now ex-uncle's house. He doesn't find a treasure trove, but what he does find is a buried coffin in the basement. And when he pulls the lid up off of that, as an aside, I'm not entirely sure what his instincts are in going into the basement and starting digging up there. He's clearly very, very physically frail uncle. Is not going to dig up and then rebury a box of cash every time he wants to buy something. That would have offed him years ago. Nevertheless, he thinks something must be buried there. He finds a coffin, and when he opens it, lo, there is a musty old skeleton in there, but also a cat which jumps out and runs upstairs and then begins to torment him. The cat, we find, is Balthazar, and was perhaps the familiar to the witch who was supposed to live there, whose skeleton that was supposed to be. And Balthazar tells him, your uncle served me, and if you serve me, I'll reward you. And that was the source of all his money. But by serving him, what Balthazar means is kill people for me. And what Balthazar does with the bodies is quite delicious, and it leads to quite a delicious ending to this little segment, which struggles, as most stories, films, TV shows about evil, demonic or killer cats struggle with, which is trying to make a cat look scary. Cats in real life, yeah, absolutely. You can look at one of those and say, I can see how you are a hell-spawn demon clothed in fur. Try and translate that onto film, and you're just cutting away to another close-up of a cat, innit? I had to look up the short story because I didn't understand why it was called Enoch, and it is an adaptation of a Robert Bloch story, which is wildly different to the one we see in the film. So I'm not entirely sure why he kept the title. The short story Enoch seems to be about a man who is, at least in his own mind, troubled by a demon who sits on his head, who is always too fast for him to catch and see, but who scratches into his brain and makes him do all sorts of horrible things. Sounds like a much more interesting story, but one that would be absolutely impossible to commit to film. The second story is named Terror Over Hollywood and follows a young starlet in her bid to achieve fame and fortune in the movie industry, which she seems to think she can do by screwing over her friend and taking over her date with a much older slimy man, and then through that date getting to make connections with other successful power brokers and stars in the film industry who are also much older than her, all the while commenting on how eternally young they all look. It is a bit of a head scratcher. It's one of these stories which is about a sort of secret Hollywood cabal of power brokers who wield some occult power, and in this day and age that does ring slightly uncomfortably QAnon-ish for my liking. It's a sort of one of those what would you do for fame stories, and then once you achieve it, is it a bit of a poison chalice? You're supposed to ask the question, why are there seemingly these immortal film stars of the silver screen who never seem to age and stay at the top of their game year on year? The question you will walk away asking yourself is, in that club that they go to, why are there two women in a giant snow globe? The payoff's silly and more sci-fi than horror, which is what I wanted, and it all seems to be gearing up towards giving a final line of dialogue like a punchline, which sort of kind of fails to land. I'm not a fan of this segment. However, that segment does look like Citizen Kane in comparison to the next story, Mr. Steinway, about a music journalist who interviews a world-famous classical pianist, and they fall in love and plan to get married, and that life takes him away from his obsessive practicing and touring schedule, which leads to his grand piano becoming jealous and murderous. Yes, you heard me right. The piano is called Euterpe, after one of the muses and goddess of music. There are visual hints all the way through that perhaps the piano is possessed by the spirit of the pianist's dead mother, whose portrait looms over the piano in most shots, and it is all as ridiculous as it sounds when I'm recanting it. I really feel for Freddie Francis, who in the final scenes of this has to make a piano look menacing. The sight of a piano attacking someone is always going to look ludicrous, and off the top of my head, I say this like it happens. I say this like it happens all the time in movies. Off the top of my head, it's been done well in Hausu, because that piano attack, yeah, we're going there. The subgenre of pianos attacking and killing people in horror movies. It doesn't work in Mr. Steinway. It works as a little spot in Hausu because really of the radically experimental way that film is put together, and that this attack looks particularly cartoonish and wildly unrealistic. It kind of sidesteps the fact that you can't ground a piano attacking someone in realism. Luckily for Torture Garden, we end with a segment which is really classy and stars Jack Palance, who has been mute up until now, just really lurking in the background, furiously sucking on his pipe with cheekbones that look like they could cut the air. This is an adaptation of Robert Bloch's excellent short story, The Man Who Collected Poe, and as a dyed-in-the-wool Poe fan, this is absolutely in my wheelhouse, and I adore this segment because it's not only got Jack Palance as an obsessive collector of the works of Poe, it's got Jack Palance opposite Peter Cushing, the only man in the world who has a superior Poe collection to him, and this obsessive monomania leads to Palance accepting Cushing's invitation to come to his house in America and see his Poe collection. And there are some items down in the basement of which no Poe collector has ever seen or heard before. Rarities beyond imagination. I've read a few reviews of this segment which suggest that Palance is way over the top and scenery chewing in this segment. I disagree absolutely. He's twitchy, sweaty palmed, nervous, in exactly the same way that the obsessive monomaniacal characters in a story by Poe would be, in something like the Cask of Amontillado or something like that. And when they go down into the basement, you exactly think that that's the kind of fate that is going to befall one of them. At first, Palance gets Cushing drunk so it'll loosen his lips up about the secrets of his collection, and it's not something you see often, but Cushing plays a wonderful drunk, not caricatured at all, but just slightly too relaxed, slightly off centre, slightly too loose-lipped. Cushing really is a phenomenal actor, isn't he? I don't think he gets his dues because he mostly sticks to genre stuff. But man, he always does everything you need of him. When we get down into the basement, I noticed in the background there's a recycled voodoo mask from Dr. Terror's House of Horror. And if you haven't seen this film, I won't give away the ending because it's something that I think is, if you're a fan of Poe, sure to delight you. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's utter nonsense, but it's glorious nonsense. I wish all the segments had been like this, but they definitely saved the best till last. There's a little bit of business at the end. There's always a coda with these kind of things, and there's a little bit of a rug pull, and what you thought was going on wasn't going on, and then there's a second reveal and said, long story short, Dr. Diabolo's the devil. I never saw that one coming. When all's said and done, it's very much of a muchness with Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. So if you enjoyed the one, I think you'll enjoy the other. They're kind of like two peas in a pod, really.